Don't you just hate it when rich people, wealthy people, successful people tell you that there is nothing here at the top? Money doesn't mean anything. I've heard it so many times where extremely wealthy people say, you know, nothing to see here, guys. Stay where you are. Poverty is, I was much happier when I was poor. Now, the thing is, what if there's an element of truth to that? What if these people who do get to the top, they say, there's nothing here when you get here? What if there's an element of truth to that? We can't, well, the point is that we can't believe it. We don't believe it. We won't believe it. There's something in us. I don't know what it is. It's related to insecurities and fears and a kind of belief in some kind of fairy tale, some kind of belief in salvation, and that money can buy us all of these things that we want that will make us happy. And of course, we must realise deep down that probably might not be as true as we think it is. But nevertheless, there is this compulsion, this will to wealth that we can't avoid. I've got a little story for you, which is like a parable. But all of this reminds me of Bill Wyman, actually, who I remember famously saying, I've slept with 4,000 women, and I can tell you it's not what it's cracked up to be. To which one of my friends answered, well, you know, I'd like to find that out for myself. And also many other people who've reached the peak of their success. I remember Martin Amis, the author, saying that, he said, when you eventually you realise that all the books you've written, I mean, they're sitting on the shelves, they mean nothing. It's just about family and relationships and that kind of thing. Sure. So what's the truth? Well, I've already said before that the secret is to never underestimate the joy of a normal life. What do I mean by a normal life? Well, I think you know. I mean, you know, a little bit of security, enough so that you don't have to worry and panic and get anxious about bills. And if you're in that situation these days, that is, to me, the peak of success, because even that is not very easy. That should, all the energy, all the focus should be in trying to achieve that, because the gutter is not a very nice place to be, and the gutter is awaiting for all of us if we make one false move, one slip up, one divorce, one redundancy, one extra drink. I mean, it's just there waiting. So if you can establish a kind of sane, normal life, then you're at the top of the tree. So what about the wealthy? What about the dream of riches? And this is a little bit of an antithesis to what I think the trend has been, the fashion has been for the last 20 years, particularly, of course, since the internet started. Everything is about aspiration, you know, how to get rich, you know, how to make money, you know, whether it be through Bitcoin or through, you know, property development. I mean, we're all obsessed with it. But why? We don't really think it's true, do we? So the story is about this guy called Neil, and I lived in France for a long time, and in a small town in rural France, and it was a kind of mix of people. You know, there was artists who lived there. There were a few expats who lived there from Holland and the UK, and there were a lot of sort of French, kind of what you call French peasant farmers in a way, or labourers. And overshadowing this town was an enormous pink chateau. I mean, it was absolutely ridiculous. I mean, I don't think I can put a picture of the actual chateau on there, because on the YouTube thumbnail, because that would sort of give the game away a little bit too much. I don't want to face any litigation, but I'll put something similar on. And this chateau had been empty for a while, and it was bought by a guy called Neil, and he was from the UK, slightly overweight, short man, who sort of wobbled up one day and bought it. And I think he bought it for about €1 million, something like that, not far off. And shortly after he moved in, I noticed that nearly everybody in the village, particularly those who were the kind of English speakers, not so much the sort of French locals, but everybody else started to try and ingratiate themselves with this guy, Neil. I didn't really know much about him. Apparently he said he was a lawyer. But really, it was absolutely awful, sort of sycophantic, dreadful, sort of, creeping around him and sort of... and all they wanted was to see whether or not his wealth or his perceived wealth could rub off on them a little bit. And he would organise these sort of fairly... well, on the face of it, lavish parties at the chateau. But in fact, they weren't that lavish when you really dug down. The wine wasn't particularly expensive. Often, I remember when he did a chicken dinner, it was undercooked, and I don't know. It was all a little bit strange. But people would go there and they would try and rub shoulders with Neil, the owner of this chateau, and a lot of them started to sort of get close enough that he would start giving them work. Can you trim a hedge? Can you do this? Do you fix cars? Can you cut the lawn? Because he had acres and acres of land. And after about 6 months, pretty much everybody was involved in some way, and he was kind of paying out in cash. And because there wasn't that much money around in that economy in rural France. And so, their little hint of money got everybody going. And so so this went on for about a year, actually, or maybe even 18 months. And he had the idea he was going to turn it into a wedding venue and sort of grand ideas. And he would kind of waltz about the place, literally being followed by once dignified people who wanted to be close to this man who owned the chateau, who they thought maybe was kind of somebody who they could kind of make money off, to be honest, I think. And also if they could even just spend a day at the chateau, sort of drinking wine with him on a hot sunny day, that kind of thing. It was all very sad. Anyway, so let's move on the story. After about 18 months, there were rumours going around that people weren't being paid, and all of these people who sort of had found a way to get little bits of cash off him by offering services. They started to find that he wasn't actually paying them, and there didn't seem to be any money around, or as much as they thought. And it got quite nasty in the end. There were lots of people and small businesses who I think in the end realised that he wasn't going to pay them. And there was a time when I think a plumbing company or a plumber actually went into the chateau at one stage and sort of turned the taps on and left them on and that kind of thing, because trying to get some sort of retribution from a man who had not fulfilled the contract and paid them. So, this started going on for a while. And yes, I was a bit involved in all of this, of course, because, I wasn't immune to any of this, and I was doing a little bit odds and sods as well. And I'd realised from the beginning that there was something very strange about this guy, Neil. It was, you didn't have to be that intuitive to realise. There was just something a bit off. There's something about his manner and something about the fact that the chateau wasn't really furnished. There was one room that was very extravagant, and then there were 30 rooms that were basically empty. So that was a bit peculiar. Now, his daughter came once, visited him, and she turned up, and I can't remember how the conversation started, but basically this guy Neil, he said to me, do you know why I bought this chateau? And I said, well, no, not really. He said, to impress my daughter. I thought, well, it's a strange reason to buy a chateau. Or maybe you don't think it is, I don't know. But to me, it seemed weird. And pretty much everything he said was this kind of weird, kind of uncanny quality to it that made you think, there's something not right here. And, you know, all the signs were there. Anyway, so nobody was getting paid, and people were beginning to get a bit concerned about this guy. And I remember going there once, and I can't remember whether the door was open, but I was inside the building. I might have been doing a bit of work in there or something. And I remember this chateau was very cold. It was quite dark in places, and it was largely unfurnished, apart from one room that had a fire in it and a small fan heater. And a half-drunk bottle of whiskey. And we saw less and less of this guy, until one day the police turned up, and they handcuffed him. They took him in a police car and was never seen again. Now, it transpired that he was a lawyer, and that he had had a bit of money, presumably, but that he had committed fraud in borrowing all of the money for the chateau. And wasn't making repayments. And I think there had been some issues as well with his previous law practice. And he was disappeared, this man, into the court system. The chateau was sold at auction, a forced auction. And I think it realised it may have been about 500,000 or 600,000 at the most. So 500,000 had just disappeared up in smoke. So what's the point of this tale? The point of this tale that here was a guy who presumably at one stage was actually quite wealthy. I mean, he apparently had law practice. But, you know, his sense of self was so low in a way that he claimed that he'd actually done this to kind of maybe prove to his daughter that he was somebody in the world, perhaps, or prove to the community, or just be king of the castle, even though it only lasted a couple of years. The whole thing was a facade. And I think the parable in this is twofold. The first is that here was a guy who could have had a very nice life, but who wanted more, and ended up sort of drinking scotch in front of a fire and a fan heater on his own in a dark room, trying to keep the cold away, surrounded by this so-called wealth, but was easily the most troubled and miserable man in the whole town. The whole thing was a facade. Now, the people who worked for him, I knew them all very well, mainly local French people. They were tradesmen, many of them. Some of them were kind of farmhands. But they all owned their own little stone cottage in the village, outright, because the stone cottages had often been inherited, or they were relatively cheap. I mean, you could have bought quite a nice little stone house back then for about 30,000 euros. And it wasn't that long ago. And I knew these people, and they had the most wonderful lives. They kind of held their own hours, they did their own work, they ate well, they drank well, for sure. They used to meet in the local bar and most nights and have wonderful kind of like joie de vivre and conversations with the friends who they'd known for a long, long time. And the contrast between what you would consider to be the sort of local, you know, general tradespeople on very small incomes, compared to this guy Neil, who seemed to have everything but actually had nothing. I think it's a warning for anybody. There is absolutely no guarantee that any of this is going to make you happy. It may well, in fact, turn you into an arse who's miserable. There's something very enticing about a normal life, about just having enough. It is achievable, and it can be wonderful. As soon as you start getting a little bit greedy for the sake of it, I would suggest one, bewares. Now, who cares what I say? Why would you believe me? But pretty much every sort of philosophical volume that's been written since, I don't know, the Upanishads in, what was that, 400 BC or something, have basically been saying the same thing. All of the wisdom of the world that's sort of contained within literature basically tells us this. Oh, we don't listen. We don't listen. We can't listen. No. Young people can't listen to their parents when they tell them this is a path to disaster. They can't listen. They have to find out for themselves. Well, that's okay. Find out for yourself. But you've got to think about it. If you're going to spend 20 or 30 years trying to accumulate something which is going to bring you nothing but misery, and you could have had instead of sacrificing 20 years for it, you could have actually started living with slightly maybe lower, more realistic expectations. Anyway, I've got to get on, but that's just what I wanted to say today, that story about Neil, because it haunted me and it was a good life lesson.